All right, we will get started now. Welcome everyone to the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program Request for Applications Workshop for the state of Vermont. My name is Christina Sweet, and I'm the Director of Regulatory Compliance at the Vermont Community Broadband Board. We're housed in the Vermont Department of Public Service. And I'm joined today by Alexi Montserrat, who is our Director of Broadband Projects, and Lucy Rogers, who is an independent consultant working with the Vermont Community Broadband Board. And in particular, she has helped develop our request for applications over the past several months. So I will go ahead and share my screen now. And as we get started today, I will just remind everyone that we are recording this presentation. So we do ask that you hold questions until the end of the presentation, after which we will stop the recording and open up the floor for questions. At that time, you can either leave a question in the chat or use the raise hand function in Microsoft Teams, and we will call on you. So as we proceed today, feel free to visit our website at publicservice.vermont.gov/VCBB. You'll find a link on that main page to the BEAD information page. There you can access the request for applications and a host of other resources about our program. We'll provide just a quick overview to the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program, to get started. This program was part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, and it provides $42.45 billion with a B dollars to expand high-speed internet access across all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and U.S. territories. The program is administered at the federal level by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, which is in turn housed in the Department of Commerce. And in Vermont, our little slice of that $42+ billion pie is $22.8 million, or $228.9 million. Sorry, $228.9 million. And the Vermont Community Broadband Board, again, within the Department of Public Service, will administer the BEAD program in Vermont. And we do intend to put the vast majority of that $228.9 million out into broadband deployment projects. So today's workshop is again going to cover the Vermont Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, what we're calling VT-BEAD. And we are going to talk through the program structure, objectives, requirements, as well as the pre-proposal and full proposal processes. And we do require that applicants to the Vermont BEAD program, or VT-BEAD program, submit both pre-proposals and full proposals in the vast majority of cases to be considered for funding. And we're really going to focus on explaining some of the key concepts in the request for applications document itself, which again, you can find on our website at publicservice.vermont.gov. And I actually encourage folks to bring up that RFA if you don't already have a copy of it, and refer as we go through the presentation today to some of those abbreviations, acronyms, and definitions that you can find on pages 2 through 6. So these are some of the terms that we're going to be using today. And as we go, we'll try to use the complete definition or the complete term when possible, but there are times that we will use an acronym or abbreviation such as location, or BSL for broadband serviceable location, NTIA, again, for the National Telecommunications and Information Administrations, and RFA for request for applications. Oh, finally, we'll talk a little bit about the overall process of applying to VT-BEAD. So cooperatives, nonprofits, public-private partnerships, private companies, utilities, local governments, and consortia with a lead applicant are eligible to apply for funding to VT-BEAD. And the real purpose of this program is to connect unserved and underserved locations throughout Vermont and reach universal broadband connectivity in a given project area. And when we get into the details of the program, Lucy will talk about the definition of unserved and underserved locations and what the project areas are. And finally, we do expect applicants to submit both pre-proposals and full proposals, and we'll talk a little bit about what that process will look like. So we will have a pre-proposal application period, which will be open beginning in December. We will discuss the timeline in more detail, and that will be followed by a pre-proposal review period. There may be some changes to the project areas that are created during that time as a result of project area modifications that applicants may request during the pre-proposal period. Finally, folks that have been selected to continue through the process will be invited to submit full proposals. And following that period, we will have a full proposal review period. There may be some negotiation with prospective or selected subrecipients at that time. And after the full proposal review period, we will be able to submit what we will call a final proposal to NTIA, the agency at the federal level who is administering the program. And that final proposal will really be a full package of the projects that we intend to fund here in Vermont. So I'm going to pass it off to Alexi Montserrat, our Director of Broadband Projects, to talk a little bit about the timeline before we get into the technical details.
Thanks. So this will probably be familiar to many of you, hopefully, if you have been keeping tabs on the website and the RFA process. You will also know that this has shifted a number of times as we've worked our way through the BEAD process. But as of now, we are opening the pre-proposal window on December 3rd. I expect no changes to that. We allowed a generous amount of time for that, partly because of the holidays, of course. We will then do a review of any requested changes and make sure that, you know, our goal there is, of course, that we know that we have statewide coverage. And once we've completed that, we'll post what the final project areas that you will be able to apply for will be. We wanted to give folks a couple of weeks with that data, so we will open the full proposal window on March 3rd and leave that open for about 6 weeks, at which point we will begin that process of evaluating and negotiating. That is as far as we are posting right now publicly. There are, of course, a lot of unknowns as far as the complexity and the number of proposals that we might receive. So we opted not to make guesses that may later turn out to be unfounded. So again, any questions about that we can take at the end. Thanks.
And now we will have Lucy Rogers get into some of the technical details of the application process.
Thank you, Christina. Good afternoon, everyone. So before we dive into the details of the pre-proposal and the final proposal, the full proposal process, I wanted to first just level set about zeroing in on a few definitions specifically related to locations. So throughout this presentation, throughout the RFA, and really throughout all of the Vermont BEAD program, when we say location, we are using that word interchangeably with broadband serviceable location, or BSL for short, which is federally defined as a business or residential location at which fixed broadband internet access service is or can be installed. And then for the Vermont BEAD program has been adjusted through the challenge process, but I just wanted to zero in on the definition for the purpose of BEAD is unserved as under 25/3 megabits per second, underserved as between 25/3 and 100/20, and served as over 100/20. So for those of you who may have participated in past VC-BEAD programs, this may be a bit different, and just making sure that we're all on the same page about what is unserved, underserved, and served for the purpose of BEAD. Under BEAD, the eligible locations are locations that are unserved or underserved. We'll talk later in this workshop about there's a possibility of also including some served locations in a BEAD project, but they are locations that you can include and serve with BEAD funding, but they are not considered eligible locations that are required to be served under BEAD. Okay, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to start with talking about this pre-proposal portion of the application process for BEAD. And there's really 3 different components to the pre-proposal portion, and I thought it would be helpful to also kind of explain the goal of each component, and that also really shows why we have this pre-proposal process in the first place. So the components of the pre-proposal process, the first is to notify VC-BEAD of your intent to participate in VT-BEAD through the submission of a pre-proposal. The goal of that is to ensure that VC-BEAD can make sure that each final project area ultimately receives at least one full proposal. Ideally, each one would receive at least one full proposal for a priority broadband project or a project that uses end-to-end fiber to all locations. So through this pre-proposal process, the best case scenario is that each project area does receive at least one priority broadband project pre-proposal. But if it does not, it gives the VC-BEAD the opportunity to understand what project areas might be at risk of not receiving a full proposal and encourage submissions from providers in that area. So the second component of the pre-proposal process is to request modifications to initial project areas that will further the goal of universal service in Vermont. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail on this, but this pre-proposal stage is the stage at which entities that intend to submit full proposals have an opportunity to ensure that the initial project areas, or ensure that the project areas that we're using for BEAD set us up in the most kind of reasonable and cost efficient way, really put us on a track to making sure that every unserved and underserved location in Vermont gets served with BEAD. So that's the goal of that, is to make sure that we're setting project areas that best serve our goal of reaching universal service. And then finally, confirming the readiness to meet BEAD gating criteria. So there'll be a few high-level questions in the pre-proposal to make sure that that prospective subrecipients understand what they need to have in order to be qualified to participate in BEAD. You can go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so this link up at the top of this page is to the VC-BEAD ArcGIS hub site. I encourage, if you have not been on this site yet, that everyone goes. This is the site where you can find the list of unserved, underserved, and served addresses as they relate to Vermont BEAD program. There also are training videos on this site that share about how to submit the BEAD pre-proposal, and there's a lot more very helpful information on the site. So this will be a useful link to make sure that you have accessible. Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to dive a little bit more into this initial project area modification request component of the BEAD pre-proposal. So on the map on this slide, you can see the initial project areas for the state. These should look quite familiar to most folks. They follow the communications union districts in Vermont. And then in the areas of Vermont where they are not communication union districts, they follow the town boundaries. The gray area in the southern part of the state is areas that those towns already are considered 100% served under BEAD definitions. So there's no initial project areas there because there will not be BEAD funding deployed in those towns. So this is our starting point. This is our map of initial project areas. And when a prospective subrecipient, when you are submitting your pre-proposal, you have the opportunity to request modifications to these project areas that will be considered when VCBB sets final project areas. So you can suggest that certain locations should be removed from the project area you're applying for and placed in another project area. One example of that would be if there's a road, in Vermont, we have many roads that kind of dip in and out of certain towns. So if there's a road that has poles along it that, dips in to one project area for a few houses and then dips back into the other project area, there might be a suggestion that it would make a lot more practical sense to move those addresses to the neighboring project area. That's that's an example that I expect will occur in a number of these instances. You can also ask for the creation of a new project area if there's certain addresses that should stand alone as their own project area, or you could ask that project areas be combined if there's a clear kind of reason why it furthers the goal of universal service. So the other component here is that you can remove unserved or underserved locations that are on the map, have been marked as broadband serviceable locations on the map, but do not actually meet the FCC definition of broadband serviceable locations. And so in that case, an example of this would be like an uninsulated camp that is clearly not eligible for being a habitable dwelling. If that had accidentally gotten on this map, you could provide evidence of that, and VCBB will review that and will consider removing it from the map and asking for a waiver from the NTIA at the end of the process if it should not be considered a part of the BEAD program. Christina, you can go ahead. Okay, so in addition to this kind of mapping component, there's also some questions you'll answer in the process of the pre-proposal. And these questions provide basic information about your entity, and they also indicate your preparedness for passing the BEAD grading criteria. So the in-depth questions that indicate your ability to pass the BEAD grading criteria happen during the full proposal process further down the road. But there are some kind of high-level questions just to ensure that you understand what you will ultimately need to be prepared to demonstrate in the full proposal process, and for on VCBB's side, just to flag any pre-proposals that might, or any prospective subrecipients that might require a conversation about gating criteria and ability to pass them. Okay, so you also are going to indicate the type of proposal you intend to submit. So priority broadband project, as mentioned before, is end-to-end fiber to every location. And then other last mile broadband deployment projects would be projects that still provide broadband service, but do not meet the technology definition of priority broadband project. Okay, next slide, please. So this is an example of the map that you'll see when you go to submit your pre-proposal. And this all, again, that website that was shown earlier to the VCBB ArcGIS hub site is where you're going to look for kind of the demonstration video of how to submit these proposals. But there will be an opportunity to select the points that you would like, the locations that you would like to request a modification for, and then for each set of locations, you'll provide a justification for that set as to why you believe they should be added to the initial project area, removed from the initial project area, form their own initial project area, or why they don't constitute broadband serviceable locations. Yep, thank you. So once the pre-proposal period has closed, there will be a review period. And during this review period, VCBB is going to set the final project areas. And ultimately, this setting of the final project areas is the ultimate decision lies in the hands of VCBB. But the goal will be to support modifications that bring Vermont closer to its goal of achieving universal service, while also maximizing the deployment of fiber and prioritizing keeping the community forum CUDs intact where possible. So those are kind of the metrics that VCBB will be using when considering modifications to initial project areas. Once this process is complete, VCBB will post the final project areas, and those final project areas will be what are used for the full proposal submissions. Okay, so I want to just talk for a minute about the relationship between entities that submit pre-proposals and entities that submit full proposals. Again, the goal here is that each project area receives a full proposal, ideally a full proposal for a priority broadband project. So if there is a project area that did not receive a pre-proposal for a priority broadband project, VCBB may actively solicit entities to submit full proposals for priority broadband projects for that area, even if there were pre-proposals for other technologies. And if an entity submits a full proposal for an area that a full proposal for a priority broadband project for an area that did not receive any priority broadband project pre-proposals, that entity will be eligible to be fully considered for that with their full proposal, even though they did not submit a pre-proposal. Similarly, if there's a project area that did not receive any pre-proposals, then any full proposals will be considered for that project area, regardless of the fact that they did not submit a pre-proposal. In all other instances, however, the full proposal will only be considered from entities that submitted a pre-proposal. So if you are considering submitting a full proposal for a project area, the right move is to submit a pre-proposal for that project area, because the goal is that we will have pre-proposals and priority broadband pre-proposals for all of the project areas. And then if that goal is met, then we will be considering full proposals only from entities that submitted pre-proposals. And then the other kind of the flip side of that is that it's really important that entities that do submit pre-proposals follow through with submitting their full proposal in order to make the pre-proposal process as meaningful as possible and make the information gained from it meaningful. So entities that file a pre-proposal will be required to file a full proposal in order to not disqualify them from receiving BEAD funding. Heading on to the next slide. So that is a bit about the pre-proposal process and the review process. I'm going to move into the full proposal process. And at the end, of course, we'll be happy to answer questions about the pre-proposal stage. So moving into the full proposal process, the goals of the full proposal process are to provide VCBB with the information needed in order to select projects that collectively maximize fiber deployment in the state while also serving as many locations as possible. The second goal is to meet the BEAD requirement to provide every unserved location in the state with at least 100 over 20 megabits per second. And then thirdly, to ensure that selected projects meet all of the BEAD gating criteria. Next slide, please. So the full proposal has, the first component of the full proposal is kind of project overview questions. And then there are components that deal with the gating and the scoring criteria. But for the overview questions, you will identify which final project area you're submitting a full proposal for, and you'll submit one full proposal for each final project area if you intend to submit for multiple ones. So in each full proposal, you'll select the final project area, and then you'll confirm that the full proposal will serve every unserved and underserved location in the final project area. And that is a requirement for submitting a full proposal. So that is not an optional question. It's just a confirmation to ensure that you meet the requirement you must meet in order to submit that full proposal. Then you'll answer whether or not you submitted a pre-proposal. And as explained previously, in many instances, a pre-proposal will be required for your full proposal to be considered, but there are exceptions to that as well. So this is just information. It's not necessarily always a requirement. And then you will answer if you are submitting a priority broadband project or a proposal that does not use all fiber technology. And after that, you'll describe your technologies. So if you submitted a priority broadband project, your answer to the describing your technologies will be 100% end-to-end fiber. And if you submitted a non-priority broadband project, you will describe which technologies you're using. And if you're using a mix, how does that mix work? And then you'll answer if you're submitting as part of a consortium. And if you are submitting as part of a consortium, then the lead member of the consortium will be the one to submit the full proposal. So at the end of these overview questions, you'll also have the option to provide a list of served locations that you're going to include in addition to the unserved and underserved locations, if you choose to include them. And I'm again have a little more information later on about that, but this is where you would provide that list. Next. I just zooming out for a second here to talk about terminology again. Project versus final project area. So final project area, as we spoke about previously, would be that location on a map, that geographical location on a map once the modifications to the initial project areas have taken place. So it would be more or less that map of initial project areas that I showed earlier with whatever modifications take place in order to facilitate a map that leads to universal service in the most efficient way. A project is a set of locations within the final project area that you commit to providing broadband service to, and that will be funded with BEAD funding. So within all of the locations of a final project area, the project consists of every unserved location within the final project area, every underserved location within the final project area, and then this optional subset of served locations within the final project area. Overall, the number of served locations that you choose to include may not exceed 20% of the total number of locations in the project. So, for example, if you have a final project area that is 50% served locations, 25% unserved, and 25% underserved, you may not have you may not include all of the locations within that geographical area as your project, because then your project would be 50% served locations, and the number of served locations cannot exceed 20%. So if you wanted to include served locations in a project for that final project area, you would need to include all of the unserved locations, all of the underserved locations, and then submit a list of served locations that would be some smaller subset of the total number of served locations that you wanted to include as addresses that would be reached with the BEAD funding. And you need to make sure that that list is not it does not exceed 20% of the overall number of locations in your project. This is an option that's available and that may make sense to some subrecipients in some instances where they're passing served locations anyway, and it makes sense to go ahead and serve them with the BEAD money and not to have to kind of separate them out of the project. But it's important to emphasize that there's no additional there's no additional advantage to including served locations other than if it just helps with the logistics of project deployment. So there's when you're scored on, you know, how much money you're requesting versus how many locations that you're serving, you're only scored on unserved and underserved locations. There's no advantage to serving locations that are already served from a BEAD scoring perspective. So that's the kind of the initial questions that you'll be asked during the full proposal. Moving on to the next sections of the full proposal, you'll be asked to answer questions that demonstrate your ability to meet gating criteria, and then answer questions that provide information for receiving a score from the scoring criteria. So just to make sure we're clear about the difference between gating and scoring criteria, gating criteria, you do not get credit for meeting them. It's more or less a pass-fail question that if you do not meet the gating criteria, you become ineligible for BEAD, absent a situation in which the VCBB chooses to apply for an NTIA waiver, but that waiver is granted. Absent that situation, you are ineligible for BEAD if you cannot satisfy the gating criteria. Scoring criteria are evaluation criteria. So that's the place where you earn points based on how well you score in those criteria. Next. So the gating criteria, these are the gating criteria that you will be asked to respond to. Managerial and operational capacity is predominantly based around who is on your team, and this can be either employees, or you may choose to, if you're working with contractors or subcontractors, you could also highlight the skills of the contractors or subcontractors to kind of show that you're prepared to excel in this area. Financial capability is where you are going to be submitting your business plan, and also either your letter of credit or your alternative plan. And I'll get into that in a minute. Relevant laws, policies, and requirements is the Build America, Buy America Act, and the national environmental requirements. Ownership and other public funding, that is an information disclosure. Technical capability is going to look different depending on what your technology is, but demonstrating that the service you're providing is ultimately going to meet the BEAD requirements for service. Low cost broadband option is the requirement to provide a lower cost plan for eligible income qualifying households. This plan is set at $30 per month and can go up to as much as $75 per month in certain situations. And then middle class affordability option is different than low cost broadband option. There was a question about this in the RFA questions. This is an option that is generally available to any customer in your area, not just to income eligible customers. And it's just demonstrating that you have a plan that is maybe lower speed, but certainly lower cost, that's generally available to support with affordability for all households in your area. Zooming in for a second on the letter of credit, there are two pathways. One is to acquire a letter of credit modeled after VCBB's model letter of credit, which is in the appendix of the RFA. And then at the time of full proposal, what you would need is a letter of commitment from a bank or credit union that they are going to issue you a letter of credit, and the actual letter would be issued if you are selected as a BEAD subrecipient. The second option is to rely on a performance bond, and this option is also further outlined in the RFA and is consistent with the NTIA's BEAD letter of credit waiver notice. Okay, the scoring criteria here, I will just go through relatively quickly, but to make sure that we're on the same page of what actually is scored. In the minimal BEAD program outlay, what is scored is the total BEAD funds requested relative to the number of unserved and underserved addresses. So as I said before, choosing to include served addresses in your project does not give you a higher score in the minimal BEAD program outlay. The other note about minimal BEAD program outlay is that there's also a component of this that deals with values. So it deals with service reliability and redundancy, recognizing that in certain instances, there may be a slightly more costly project that provides a higher quality outcome. So we want to take that into account. Affordability is based on the cost of service for a 1 gigabit symmetrical plan for priority broadband projects, and for 120 for non-priority projects. Fair labor standards is both past record as well as future plans. Community input and engagement, there's a list of 7 ways to fulfill this criteria, and 4 of them must be met in order to receive the points. Local coordination, there are 6 ways to fulfill this criteria, and at least 3 of them must be met to receive the points. Speed to deployment is just a couple of points. It's whether you plan to have, if you plan to have the whole network up and running prior to the 4-year BEAD deployment window. And then speed of network and other technical capabilities will only be scored for projects that are not priority broadband projects. I wanted to zoom in for a second on the matching funds requirement. So BEAD requires a 25% minimum match for each project to be provided by each prospective subrecipient. This is a challenging requirement for Vermont specifically, based on VCBB's analysis of some of the high-cost rural areas of the state. And so we are asking that each prospective subrecipient carefully analyze the impact on the match requirement, the impact of the match requirement on their ability to provide service in their specific project area based on the demographics of the area, the geography, and other relevant factors. And if that analysis results in the conclusion that your project area cannot be well served without a waiver of the 25% matching requirement, then we want to encourage that you still submit a full proposal, because we recognize that there are some project areas that cannot be served with this requirement. So please still submit a full proposal. If that full proposal is selected, the process moving forward from there would be that VCBB, in its final proposal to the NTIA, would request a waiver of the 25% match for that project area, or for that project, and then the NTIA would issue a final determination of whether that project can be funded. So the BEAD full proposal submission is going to happen through this Ampli Fund grant management system. So I'm just flagging that this is going to be a different submission location than the pre-proposal, which you can find the pre-proposal link. It will be through the BEAD ArcGIS hub site.
We are currently developing the AmpliFund application, so that information will be ready to go when well before we open the full proposal process, and you can find that on our website at that time. We'll also provide some additional training and videos on how to use AmpliFund.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, that is really the substance of what I wanted to share today. I want to briefly touch on the review process, because I think it helps to just put all of this information into the context of where are we ultimately going with the information that we're asking for during the pre-proposal and full proposal periods. But I want to say that there will be a further workshop that dives in deeply onto into the review process and the scoring process. So just to flag that that's coming and that this is a very high level overview. But the process of reviewing full proposals is that, first of all, priority broadband projects will get reviewed first for each project area. So the first question that will be asked is, did this project area receive priority broadband projects, and do they meet the gating criteria? And this includes, which one? This includes making sure that they submitted a pre-proposal if that is required in that project area. And then the eligible priority broadband projects are scored, and negotiations then take place with the prospective winner to ensure that the cost of the project is within what the VCBB can offer under Vermont BEAD in order to still serve every location in the state. So if that whole process takes place and there are no priority broadband projects that can be funded with BEAD in an area, then the next step is to look at non-priority broadband projects that provide reliable broadband service. In a future workshop, we can dive in a lot deeper into reliable broadband service versus not reliable broadband service, which is an NTIA defined term. And so the same process will be repeated with the non-priority projects that provide reliable broadband service. And then if that process does not create a winning proposal, then the review process moves on to non-priority projects that do not provide reliable broadband service. And so just again, this will be covered in much more detail in the future, but just because it's relevant for the context of where we're headed, the extremely high cost per location threshold. There's really a couple things I want to highlight from this, but the overall way that this is set is that it is set after all of the full proposals are received. It's not a number that exists at this moment in time, and it can be different from project area to project area. Those are kind of the main, I guess, the three things I would emphasize is it's set after the full proposals are received. It can differ from project area to project area, and also it's set iteratively. So it's what this extremely high cost per location threshold is for each project area may go through a few iterations before the final bids are selected. And so the process of setting this is the first step in the process is to take the lowest cost priority broadband project bid for each project area, and then an estimate of the cost to deploy fiber for project areas that did not receive a priority broadband project bid, and then add that all together, subtract any additional available funding. That basically means like matching funds that have been committed through the BEAD, through the full proposal bid process. That would be the main source of that. And then from those two numbers, establish an extremely high cost threshold with the principle of maximizing fiber deployment while also ensuring that all unserved and preferably all underserved, but as many as possible, are served with that threshold. Next slide, please. So a couple considerations are that, as I said, this can be an iterative process. It's not established until every project area has a winning project, because negotiations taking place in one project area could impact the extremely high cost per location threshold in another project area. And again, this will be covered in greater detail, but I did want to just give the quick overview of that. So the review team will go through this selection process, select a winning proposal for each project area. And then the VC-BEAD board is going to review and confirm that the process used by the review team is consistent with the process that we have set forward in all of our BEAD planning materials. And ultimately, as mentioned previously, ultimately the VC-BEAD will then submit the final proposal to the NTIA, to the federal government for their approval. And that is when we will officially have our official BEAD subrecipients for the state of Vermont. So with that, this timeline slide is just put up here one more time because Alexi, did you want to say anything on this, or did you want to just? Okay, just one more time to view it now that we've talked in more detail about each step of the process. But then I think we can move on to a question and answer. Thank you for listening to all that information, and thanks for saving all your questions until now. So I think if you want to raise your hand or just unmute and jump in, we can also just take a minute to digest.
Thank you, Lucy, for that very thorough overview. I feel like I understand our own program better every time I hear you explain it.
Thanks, Christina. Anyone have any questions?